So today, we're going to begin a new book of the Bible. We're looking at the book of Daniel. And I'm going to begin with a simple question for you that all of you should be able to answer with no problem. The question is this: is the United States a Christian nation? Is the United States a Christian nation? Is America a Christian nation? All right, I've already heard two different answers already. And here's the interesting thing. If you think about that, some would say that we were founded on Christian principles. And so, yes, we're a Christian nation. I mean, if you take out a dollar bill, what's it say? In God we trust, right? In God we trust. And in the Constitution, we have the freedom of religion. And so some people say, yeah, we are a Christian nation. We can choose how we're going to serve God, and we serve God. But you could also go back to the founding, and some would say we're not founded on Christian principles, but on humanist principles and deist principles. And it says in God we trust on our money, but do we really trust God? Or how many think that as a nation we trust money more than God, right? I mean, let's face it. And yeah, we're free to worship how we choose, but we live in a nation where people are free to abort children for any and every reason right up to the age of birth. So, I mean, you get a lot of arguments, a lot of conflicts about whether we're a Christian nation or not. But the thing we need to recognize is, as a nation, we are a culture. Every nation is a culture. And a culture is how we view the world. What's the best way to interact, to live our lives. And nations, just like cultures, change. Our nation has changed a lot in 200 and some years. Our cultures change constantly. In fact, they change rapidly. And there are a lot of things where you say, well, what used to be right is now wrong, what used to be wrong is now right, and it's changing. And there are things that need to change in our culture, and there's things that need to stay the same. Here's the challenge for you and me. If you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a Christian, guess what you are a citizen of? You're a citizen of two kingdoms. You're a citizen of the United States or Kenya or the Philippines or somewhere. You're a citizen of some earthly culture, earthly nation, but you're also a citizen of the kingdom of God. And there's this challenge. There's this tension about living in two cultures, living in two kingdoms. As a Christian, should we adopt the culture that we're part of? Should we adapt to the culture? Should we change the culture? Should we fight the culture? Should we reject the culture? What are we called to do as Christians? The interesting thing is that God's people have been wrestling with this, not for the last 20 years, not for the last 200 years, not for the last 2,000 years. Throughout history, God's people wrestled with what's it mean to be a part of two different cultures. And that's why we're looking at the book of Daniel. Because the book of Daniel is a book that wrestles with living in a culture where there's compromise. So we're going to be looking at what's it mean to live in a land of compromise. The book of Daniel was written in a time when the nation of Israel had lost its influence, lost its power, and was destroyed. And Daniel was a man who was an Israelite living in Babylon, living in a foreign nation. And he was wrestling with, do I adapt? Do I adopt? Do I change? Do I fight? What do I do? How do I live in this land of compromise? So I'm going to invite you to turn to the book of Daniel, and we're going to go through the first chapter today. Next week, we're going to do chapter 2. I encourage you, as we are going through the book of Daniel, to read this whole book. I believe it's 12 chapters long, and each time you're reading it, ask yourself, where are we at? What does it mean? How do I wrestle with this culture I'm a part of? Okay? So the book of Daniel, chapter 1, is where we're going to begin today. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So here's what's the situation that's taking place in the book of Daniel. We have the nation of Israel. It's been a nation for hundreds of years. God's people, they have a law, a Torah, commands on how to live to where they are distinct from other cultures of the world. They are separate. They are to be different so that people see a difference between following God and following other cultures. But over the course of years, God's people had not been faithful. God's people had compromised. And so as a result, God sent other nations, allowed other nations to attack them and defeat them as a sign of judgment. So Israel had compromised, and now God was using the Babylonians to bring judgment on them. And that began, well, there's 3 dates. Basically, 605 BC is the first time the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar came, and they attacked Jerusalem, and they took part of the temple treasuries and some of the people of God into exile. And then in 597, they did it again, and then 587, 86, that area, the third time the Babylonians came and they destroyed Judah. They destroyed the walls around Jerusalem. They destroyed God's temple. So there's a 20, 30-year period of time where this judgment is coming. Daniel is the first invasion, 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar came with his army. Well, I don't think he went, but his army went. And they went to the temple, and they took some of the treasures, and they took the best of the best young men of Judah and the king and took them back to Babylon. So that's where we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 1. They're in Babylon, and it says that the king carried off treasures, articles from the temple of God, and he carried them to the temple of Babylon and put them in his treasure, or in the house of his God. So basically, it's a fight. It's kind of like the playground. When I was a kid, we'd be on the playground, and we wanted to establish ourselves. I'm tougher than you, and another kid's tougher than me, and several times we didn't want to fight each other, so we said, oh yeah, well my dad could beat up your dad. That type of thing, right? Now we never got our dads to come fight, but we did that. That was a way of establishing our dominance. And that's really what Nebuchadnezzar was doing. By coming and attacking and taking the treasury of the temple and taking some of the best, he's saying, my God is better than your God. Okay? My God's better than your God. And the reality is, every cultures are about who is God. We're still in this God fight today. My God is tougher than your God. And so, the way this worked was, in verse 3, we see that the king ordered Ashpenaz, who was a chief official, to get some of the Israelites from the royal family, and he did this from the other nations as well. Young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude of every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He chose the best of the best. He was a headhunter. He was a talent. He was searching for talent. And they would teach them the language and literature of Babylon, and the king assigned a daily amount of food and wine, and they were trained for 3 years, and after that they were into the service of the king. And we see that there are 4 Jewish men who were chosen for this: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they are the best of the best in Judah. The best of the Jewish young men are chosen to be indoctrinated by the king, to learn a new culture, to learn a new language, so that they could serve the king of Babylon. So they are brought in to be an influence. Now, my first reaction when I think of this is, why would they do that? I mean, they're being brought in to be brainwashed by this foreign king. They're going to be swayed away. Why would there be any reason to do that? But then I think, what better way to influence the king of Babylon and to try to help them see who God is than to be on the inner circle, right? So they're learning these new languages, new customs, but they have an opportunity to do something significant. They can engage the culture, or they can say, no, I'm just going to reject the culture. And the reality is, Not only Daniel and these people wrestling with whether or not to engage the culture, but we still wrestle with that throughout history. We wrestle with how do we engage the culture. I'm going to share with you just some ways that Christians traditionally have engaged culture, okay? Sometimes they're what's called a triumphalistic method, which means that the church should be in charge. The church controls the state. And that, throughout history, there have been times we've tried to do that. Constantine became the emperor, and all of a sudden, the church was in control. And even throughout much of history, the kings in Europe, they had to bow down to the Pope. Now we think, we don't do that anymore, but yet, sometimes I hear people say, well, let's make America a Christian again. Let's make it a Christian nation, right? Let's be in charge. And I understand that. Jesus is Lord. He's the king. He's my king. I want him to be in charge of the nation, right? But yet, Jesus refused to become king in Israel when they tried to make him king. So there's some people, there's that approach of, well, let's let the church be in charge of America. There's another approach that's more of a transformationalism, they call it. And that means the church we should Christianize our culture. An example of that would be Calvinism. In Switzerland, the city of Geneva, they tried to make it the church influence that city. We've done that in the United States. About a decade ago, well, more than that, but a generation or two ago, a moral majority said, hey, if we get enough influence, we can change our culture by how we vote. And if we get enough power and political influence, we can change it. There's a movement now called the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is the same thing. If we have power, we can make the world what it should be. We can change the culture for God. And I agree. I understand that. We're called to transform our society. But the problem is, Jesus said, the one who wants to be in charge, you don't lead by power, you lead by serving. The greatest is the servant. And legalism and forcing people to believe a certain thing, that's not the way of Christ. So maybe that's not the way. There's one other way I'm going to share with you, and then we'll move on. And that's just separatism. That's to say, well, then we're just going to reject the culture. We're going to leave and we're going to go hide, get in a holy huddle. And throughout history, that's been happened. It took place with desert fathers where they'd go off and just live in isolation, a hermit's life. We have, in many ways, some ways America started like that because the Pilgrims, they said, we're going to leave this culture and go start a new culture, a totally different culture. Amish is a current thing. The good thing about that is we stay pure. The bad thing is we don't have any influence. We don't change our culture. So we wrestle with, how do I engage the culture? It's been happening for forever. And that's what Daniel and his friends are wrestling with. Do we engage the king or not? In fact, what's interesting is they seem to decide to just adopt to the king. Because if you look in the very next verse, all four of these men are given new names. Daniel is named Belteshazzar, which means the prince of Baal. It's a name to identify him with a different god. Hananiah is called Shadrach, Mishael is called Meshach, and Azariah is called Abednego. So they are given names that tie them to other gods, and they don't fight it. I think of that and I think, why would this be in the Bible? Why would this be in the Bible? Daniel allows himself to be called Belteshazzar. Maybe Daniel needed to hear what my wife told me once, and that was, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Maybe Daniel needed to hear that. Maybe he needed to realize that there are some mountains, some hills you should die on, worth fighting for. Maybe he needed to hear, well, this tradition says that at the Alamo, when the Texans were fighting the Mexican army, and the commander at the Alamo drew a line in the sand, and he said, all right, you can either leave or you cross this line and you fight to the death. And maybe Daniel needed a line in the sand because he was just adopting the culture. Do you ever adopt the culture? Do you ever just give in to the culture? Do you ever just give up and say, I'm not even going to fight it anymore? Yet, something significant happened in verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked his chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Daniel was willing to let them call him a different name, and so were the other three. They were willing to be taught and learn this other language, these other cultures, but they drew the line when it came to the food and the drink. Now we think maybe that's because it was non-kosher, but I think most would argue that really it's about what that food represented. You see, in the ancient world, when they would sacrifice an animal to their god, they would take and they'd have an altar and they'd put the animal on there, they'd cut the throat, bleed it, and then they would take some of the meat and they would cook it and they would eat that. And so it's a sign of saying, this animal is being sacrificed to God, and when we eat that animal, and sometimes they'd even drink the blood, they're saying, we are identifying, we commit ourselves to the God as well. And Daniel said, I draw a line. You can call me what you want, because I know who I am. I'm Daniel. God judges. I'm the one who trusts in Elohim, Yahweh, to judge. Call me what you want, I don't care. Tell me what you want, teach me, I don't care. But when it comes to who I will worship, who I am allegiant to, who I will bow down to, that's where I draw the line. I will not compromise. Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, they would not compromise on who God was. It's interesting. They even said, give us a test. For 10 days, feed us nothing but vegetables and water. And then see if it makes a difference. See if there's not evidence that we're doing the right thing. And in verse 13, they even said, and then compare us and treat your servants according to what you see. They were willing to do a 10-day vegetable and water fast. The point of this is not a Daniel fast. The point isn't that if you drink water and eat vegetables for 10 days, suddenly you're going to look different and you're going to be healthy and you're going to be happy and everything will be perfect. That's not what this is about. The point isn't so much what the fast, the point is that they were saying, if something's not different, we're going to risk our life on this. And if we're not different, take us to the king, and if he wants to kill us, he can kill us. They drew a line in the sand. They said, we will not compromise. And we are willing to risk our life for that. You see, what they were saying is this. Some things are negotiable. Some things I can adjust to, we adapt. Not everything is a matter of life and death. But when it comes to who God is, when it comes to what he does, and when it comes to whether I bow to him or anybody else, that's where I draw the line. I refuse to negotiate when it comes to who is my God. And then after 10 days, they looked so much better that says in verse 17 that the four men God gave them knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. Daniel could understand visions and dream dreams, which we'll see in the very next chapter taking place. And at the end of the time, the chief official took him to the king himself to be validated. And the king had the power to say, you didn't compromise, I'm going to kill you. But instead, the king said this. He found no equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters of the whole kingdom. Because they refused to compromise about who God is, God gave them favor for their faithfulness. He honored them for their faithfulness, and he used them for his glory, and we'll see that throughout the rest of the book. God used them for his own glory. All because they were willing to draw a line in the sand. All because they said, we will not negotiate about this. In a culture that compromises, we will not negotiate about our God, about our allegiance to our God. That's the same thing Jesus did. Same thing Jesus did. When the night before he went to the cross, he was in the garden. And he prayed, God, if there's any other way, if there's any change, anything, please. But not my will, but your will be done. I will not compromise when it comes to your will, God. So, as we look at the book of Daniel, as we think about what does it mean to live in a land where there's compromise all around us, in our culture, sometimes in our families, sometimes in our churches, there's compromise all around us. How will we live in a way where we refuse to compromise? It means that we need to learn to distinguish between what's negotiable and what's not. What's non-negotiable. And refuse to compromise. So let me give you a couple ideas of what that might look like. I guess I have to thank Debbie for this. She got us started this morning on it. Because one of the ways, think about our culture. How does our culture compromise? What does it mean to live in a culture that says you get to define who you are? What you feel determines who you are as a person. What does it mean to live in a culture that says you can define what's true for you? What's true for you is different than what's true for me, and that's okay. That's true. What's it mean to live in a culture where God is often put to the back, pushed to the back, and placed behind work or family or sports? What's it mean to live in a culture where we look to the government to solve all of our problems? A man-made government to solve our problems. So here's a few things that maybe how we identify and refuse to compromise on what's non-negotiable. One of us is this, that it doesn't mean that there's never a time for us to interact, to be flexible, to wrestle with where that line is. We have to wrestle with that line, even in our culture. It means we have to be willing to adjust, but not to attack people, but attack ideas, attack systems, attack thoughts, but not people. People are not the enemy. People are not the enemy. Philosophies, ideas, spiritual enemies, that's the enemy. Okay? So it's not about people, it's about the ideas and the things that shape the ideas of our culture. So here's a few questions that may help with this. Ask yourself, what does it mean, or ask yourself this question. Am I allowing God to define my identity? Am I allowing God to define what it means to be human? Am I allowing God to define what it means to be male and female? Or am I trusting in myself to determine that? Or trusting in my feelings to determine, or trusting in our culture to define what that is? Where do we draw the line? Am I placing my pleasures above God? Am I placing what I want in my life above what God has in store for me? That's about purpose. When it comes to our children, am I appeasing my child pleasing them, wanting to make sure that I'm my child's friend, rather than parenting how God wants me to parent? Am I more concerned about whether my child's happy or their teacher's happy or their coach is happy than whether my child learns to become a godly adult who refuses to compromise? Am I placing everything else above my child's spiritual health, before the church, before God? Another question: are my decisions evidence that I believe the culture has a better solution to life than I have? I think about it like this. Culture tells us that if you want something, you deserve it. And you can go into debt. Just go into debt and it's yours. You can have it, whether it's an education or a car or a house or a vacation or whatever. Just go into debt, you can have it. Never say no to yourself. Are you trusting the culture to define that? Or are you trusting God to show you what is a need and to provide your needs and to teach you how to say no, how to be satisfied, how to not seek what you want, but seek what He wants? Are you looking for shortcuts to faithfulness? Shortcuts to God rather than faithfulness? See, being a follower of Christ means to have a long obedience in the same direction. Doesn't mean you turn a little bit to God and then you turn to the culture. It means you keep going towards Him. And finally, are you taking responsibility for yourself or expecting the government or somebody else to take responsibility for you? Are you taking responsibility for your family, for your church family? Are you taking responsibility for your community or expecting solutions to come from outside? Those are questions that I pray help us to determine where do we draw the line? Where do we put God and draw the line so that we do not negotiate on what's non-negotiable? I'm going to share one quote, or I've shared this before, but it's so powerful to me. I think this helps us think about this line issue. A few years ago, I was in Kansas City at a display about the Holocaust. And I read a quote from a German pastor named Martin Niemöller. He was incarcerated in two different concentration camps from 1937 to 1945. And this is what a Christian pastor, just like me, said. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. I didn't draw a line. And then they came for the Social Democrats, and I did not speak out because I'm not a Social Democrat. He didn't draw a line. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, but there was no one left to speak for me. Where do we draw the line? You see, Martin Niemöller lived in a culture that compromised. Israel was a culture that compromised, and God judged them for it. Daniel lived in a culture that compromised in Babylon. We live in a culture that compromises. Every culture compromises from now until the day Jesus comes back and establishes the kingdom of God on earth. The question isn't whether the culture will compromise. The question isn't whether the United States of America is going to compromise. The question is whether you will compromise. Whether we as a church will compromise. But if we say this is non-negotiable, we will not compromise on who God is. We will not compromise our allegiance to Jesus the King. God will honor our faithfulness. And He will use us not for our glory, but for His glory. in a land of compromise, today's the day to draw a line in the sand. Amen. Part of that starts with this table. When we gather at this table, we are making a declaration of who Jesus is and of our devotion, our commitment, and our allegiance to him. This table today is a line in the sand. We're going to sing one more song about grace. As we do, use this as an opportunity to prepare your heart. And ask yourself, is my devotion to God and God alone? Do I trust Jesus as my Lord? Do I commit to him above all others? And recognize that there are things in life that are negotiable, but this is the one thing I will not negotiate on: who Jesus is.